Hi there, this is Tim Cornick with Reverend Guitars. Today we're going to talk about the Wilkinson Tremolo system. It's our most commonly used vibrato, the WV50, on all of our guitars here. There's not a lot of videos online detailing how it's used and all the different specs, so we're going to try and cover as many bases as possible and hopefully have timestamps in the bottom of the video here so you can kind of jump to whatever your issue is. But before we get into any of that, we should get into the parts of the Wilkinson Trem and what makes it different than the most common ones that you probably are familiar with. Like most guitarists, we're used to 6-point tremolos like this. Now this particular one is a Wilkinson WV6, like you see on our Pete Anderson baritone. It has 6 holes in the top where you would mount 6 screws directly into the body, and through springs in the trem cavity that come out through the back here, this trem plate would be flush against the body, meaning that when you put the arm in and bend down, you can bend notes downward but not up, as it would hit the body flush. The Wilkinson Trem is what we call a 2-point tremolo. So there are these 2 trem posts that are mounted into the body, and they sit with a little notch there on the edge of the trem plate. And there's your fulcrum, if you remember your simple machines from school. But in doing so, this trem plate does not sit flat against the body. So this is what's called a floating tremolo, meaning whenever you attach the arm, you can bend downward just like the 6-point, but you can also pull up and bend notes upward. Because of that, there's a little more to do when it comes to setting up your guitar with a 2-point tremolo. And we'll get into that in good time, but for now, let's go over the rest of the parts. So, in your 6-point trem, you have your string saddles. You string the guitar through the back of the trem block, up over the saddle, to the nut, to the tuner, and that's pretty standard fare. To adjust action, you have these little screws on top that are action adjustment screws. And to adjust intonation, there's a screw on the back side toward the end pin of your guitar that you can move left or right to adjust the distance to the 12th fret and change your 12th fret note should it be sharp or flat. With the Wilkinson Trem, it's a little more complicated than that. You'll see it still has the action adjustment screws, these set of 2 screws on each saddle at the top. And it does have intonation adjustment screws, but because there's no spring, like you'll see on the 6-point trem, these are not held in place by the trem plate. They're held in by these lockdown screws, which are these big black screws on top of each saddle. Because these screws lock everything down, to make any adjustment on a Wilkinson Trem, you'll need to loosen those to move them around. So if you need to change the height of your string, which is your action, you'll need to loosen this lockdown screw to then adjust your action adjustment screws at the top. If you need to make an intonation adjustment, you'll loosen your lockdown screw and adjust that intonation adjustment screw. There's a big caveat here, and the big point is because there's no spring moving that intonation adjustment screw back and forth, using the screw at the end really doesn't matter. The main point is you're going to loosen your lockdown screw and move this saddle either with your hands or with a small tool of some sort to move it where you need it to be. Those intonation adjustment screws really, because there's no spring, can only pull the guitar or the saddle closer to the end pin by tightening. If you loosen it, because there's no tension, it's not going to move it back up. You need to tap it back. It's one of the kind of confusing things and a little different than most other trem bridges and even hardtail bridges. So that's your typical intonation adjustment and action adjustment. Once you're done moving the saddle around, you tighten those lockdown screws and they stay in place no matter what. Another good piece of information and a difference between your 6-point and your 2-point trems are that because the 6-point trem is fastened with the 6 screws on top, you can replace all the strings at once if you like. This isn't going anywhere, and you can clean your fretboard and do whatever you need to do. If you're trying to make full-scale changes like that on a WV50 equipped model with the 2-point trem, it is wise to leave at least one string attached. So because this is a floating trem, it is held on by the springs in the back of the trem cavity, which we'll get to in just a second, and the strings holding it to the nut and the tuners at the top of the headstock. If you remove those strings, there's no tension on those springs, and this can fall out, which will lead you to essentially need to do a full setup again and get your angles and tension all set again. So my best tip for, let's say you're using this on a rosewood or dark fretboard wood guitar and you want to clean the fretboard or condition it with lemon oil or F1 oil or something of that sort. The best tip I have is to leave the low E and the high E attached to the guitar when you remove the rest. That way you can loosen them a little bit and still get to the cover the entire fretboard without having to completely reset this trem. You replace the other strings, then replace the low E and high E, and you should be good to go. One of the most common questions I get from people who are using a WV50 for the first time is how to properly set the arm. With your traditional Strat trem, you have an arm that has threads on the outside, and that just screws into the trem plate just fine. And you can loosen or tighten it to your taste, and it's a pretty simple operation. Most trems work that way. With the WV50, you'll see that the outside is smooth and the inside has machining. So that's how it connects through an internal screw. In doing so, you'll see you have this trem arm sleeve here. You'll fit it in and tighten it up, just like you would a standard Strat trem. But there's a set screw on the underside. This is from the end pin, a set screw that you can adjust to tighten that arm as much as you like. Again, adjust it to taste. Some people like them very stiff, other people like them loose. But that's an important part to this whole setup as to how to keep your trem arm where you want it. How to set up your guitar with a Wilkinson trem. As you may know, all of our setup specs are listed on the owner's manual on our website. If you click the support button, it's at the very bottom of the page under Reverend Guitar and Bass Owner's Manual. That will include string heights, pickup heights, and other adjustments to get you close to what we set up our guitars before they go out to our dealers and on to you. It's a great ballpark and a great tool to refer to, but there's a couple things with the Wilkinson trem that are a little tricky, so let's get into that here. So on the bench in front of me, I have a 6-gun HPP that has the WV50 trem, and whenever you're doing a setup or changing strings, it's always advised to remove the plate on the back side of the guitar. So I've already done that, but that's your trem plate. It has 6 screws. You remove those, and there you are. Now, with most Strat trems and any guitar that does have a trem, you'll note that there's a ground wire that's connected to the electronics to create your ground to the bridge and the strings. You have the trem claw here, the Vericlaw, which is attached by two trem claw screws. You have a number of springs back here. You can have up to 5, and the Vericlaw allows you to change their locations. Again, that's mostly to taste, how much tension you want in your trem arm and whatnot. And then this is the back plate of that, the trem block of the Wilkinson. So, if you're going to change strings, once you remove them, you'll feed them through these holes up through the back, or up through the front of the guitar, I should say. and in through the nut and the tuners. That's pretty simple. But let's say you've changed strings, perhaps to a different gauge or tension, and things aren't playing quite the way they used to. The very first thing I would recommend is taking a look at the trem plate. So not where the saddles are, but the plate beneath them. A proper setup with a Wilkinson trem, as we do them, you'll note that that trem plate is parallel to the body. So they are running evenly along with each other. Now, to get that to sit parallel like that, there needs to be a modicum of an equilibrium between the string tension on the top of the guitar and the spring tension in the back of the guitar. So, we set up our guitars with 10 through 46 D'Addario strings, and let's say you jumped to 12s or something like that. That's going to be a lot more tension on the neck and on the bridge itself. So that would, in theory, pull that trem plate up. So you string your guitar like you would normally, and instead of that trem plate being parallel to the body, let's say this is your body and the trem plate is sitting like this. The first adjustment I would make, outside of loosening the strings a little bit, is to the trem claw. In that scenario, the smartest thing to do is to tighten these two screws, which will add more tension to the springs and bring that trem plate down and parallel to the body again. That's the first step with any Wilkinson setup, is making sure that that trem plate is parallel to the body. You can do that another way as well. If you prefer to have a little more tension on your trem arm, you can add more springs or change their orientation. Some people like to have these angled. Some people only like to have the outer two. It's really up to you. But there's a lot of different ways to do it. Use as many as you like. But a combination between the right amount of springs and the right amount of tension on your trem claw is going to help you get that trem plate even and parallel to the body, so that way you can make your guitar work just right with whatever string gauge you like and whatever tuning. So we've got the trem plate where we want it. When the guitar is in tune, it's still parallel to the body. The next step is, of course, setting your intonation. That's going to work just like you would with any other guitar. You're going to tune the open string when everything's in tune, and then tune at the 12th fret. Play lightly. Because we use some pretty big fret wire, if you try to fret too hard whenever you're setting your intonation, you may find that you're pulling notes sharp, and that's not good whenever you're trying to just give a general idea of intonation up the neck. So, play an open string, fret lightly at the 12th fret, and you'll adjust your saddle to whatever your reading is for the 12th fret. So if it's too sharp, you're going to want to back it out. So you'll tighten this, you'll loosen your lockdown screw and then tighten the intonation screw, so that way the saddle moves closer to the end pin, creating more distance between the saddle and the 12th fret. And you'll have to guess and check to make sure that you get proper intonation. But once you do, lock down that screw again and move on to the next string, and complete until your guitar is properly in tune. Once you have proper intonation, that's when you'd probably want to do your string heights or action adjustment. It's the same thing as we detailed at the beginning of the video. You'll go back down here, measure from the 12th fret to the bottom of the string, and if you need to make an adjustment, loosen your lockdown screw and then raise or lower the two action adjustment screws. One note here is that it's important that both of these action adjustment screws are touching the plate at the same time. If you find that you're getting some strange rattling sounds from the bridge plate, it could be that only one of those is hitting. So whenever you're playing that string, you're getting weird vibrations in there. So just make sure that both of those action adjustment screws are touching the trem plate. A couple things that are common troubleshooting issues with Wilkinson trems are mostly related to the nature of the trem itself. And I will grab our loose one here to show that. As we discussed at the beginning, the WV50 trem is a 2-point trem, and it sits on a fulcrum on these trem posts. So when it sits in there, you'll see there's a notch on the trem plate, and it sits in that notch right there. Because this is exposed and it's not fastened down to the body like a 6-point trem, this will move up and down, but your hand is also in that general area when you're playing a lot, and there's the possibility that over time you could get some grime and some unwanted debris in the area. Sometimes, after a long period of use, you may find that there's a clicking whenever using the trem, or it just doesn't feel like it's seated right. That's an important thing, that whenever you're changing strings or cleaning up the saddles, maybe take a Q-tip and try and clean out any debris that's sitting in that notch. Doing so will make sure that your trem is working properly and prevent any unwanted wear in the wrong places. So that's it. That's the best primer I can give for the Wilkinson WV50 tremolo system. If there's something that I missed, or you have a different question, comment, concern, please drop it in the comments below or send an email to sales@reverendguitars.com, and I'll do my best to help you out.